Hi, good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. Before I introduce our special guest today, for those of you who've never used our system, if you have a comment or a question, type it in the lower right or left-hand corner where it says comments or questions. If you want to clap or find something funny or brilliant, there are three emojis that you can use. And if you need to send a private message to anyone, just move your cursor over their photo or their circle next to their name, and a window will pop and you can send a private message. If you have some burning issue that you want to share, you can press the microphone next to your name and I'll get a message that you'd like to join the panel. So our special guest today is Laurie Lee, who has an incredible background. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable some of the things that he's done. I hope that they're all true. And he's going to share with us his experiences having been head of Gates Foundation in Africa, but also the challenges of getting investors interested in impact and often the lack of communication or speaking a different language between the nonprofit and the for-profit. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to go on mute and share with us your journey and what you've learned.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks everybody for joining. I was just thinking as you were speaking there, Robert, and also during the intro video, maybe there's a couple of kind of themes in my career to date that are particularly relevant to this question of impact investing. So one is, if the Impact Investing Institute in the UK would certainly describe the UN's SDGs as one of the key impact frameworks for measuring the impact of an impact investment. And the SDGs and their precursor, the MDGs, have been at the sort of heart of my whole career for the last 25 years. In fact, my very first job when I joined DFID as a junior civil servant was to help to turn what was then a little OECD DAC booklet called the International Development Targets into a document that the G8, which the UK government was hosting in 1998, could adopt as its targets for achieving real impact with aid, obviously, primarily. And that eventually turned into the Millennium Development Goals a couple of years later through the UN. And then I was involved a little bit on the SDG side when they came about in 2015, which of course was when the first MDGs ran out, when I was working well, in the build up to that at the Gates Foundation, but I was less involved in that. But I definitely think that setting those targets was transformational for global development, and particularly for making better use of international aid. So in terms of impact investing, I suppose my career has been all about the impact, and I really feel that impact investing can help us achieve that impact. And I suppose the other kind of thread in my career has been about joining dots and creating links between things which are not so obvious. So I've worked both in the UK government as a diplomat around the world. I worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as you mentioned, Robert. I was chief executive of Care International, one of the big UK NGOs, part of the Global Care International Confederation. And I've done a lot of work in partnership with private sector companies at Care. For example, we did partnerships with, I think, 10 FTSE 100s while I was chief exec for 8 years. And I think impact investing is about bringing together what may at least historically have been seen as unusual partnerships that bring together, traditional capital investors and the impact community and people who are thinking about that. And so, in a sense, I've always wanted to see impact investing happen. In fact, my very last job in the UK civil service before I joined Gates Foundation was head of international trade. And that was all about thinking about how we helped developing countries through both our trade policy and market access, but also aid to support exports, use the private sector and economic growth to make progress. So I've always believed in that, and yet I guess when I came to care and I wanted to see whether or not there was an opportunity for us to develop partnerships with impact investing, to invest in the impact on the SDGs that care was undoubtedly having, it turned out to be much more difficult to join those dots than I really imagined. I originally come from a town in the north of England called Hull, where John Venn also happens to come from, who went on to invent the Venn diagram. So I'm a big fan of the Venn diagram. But the overlapping part of the Venn diagram, it seems to me, between international NGOs and impact investors is surprisingly small, given that the SDGs and impact is the absolute core of what international NGOs do every day.
You said that the SDGs gave a clear target and they've been very successful, but was it really the SDGs that made a difference, or was it just mainly China that made the difference, whether and not specifically following the SDGs, just focusing development for China?
Well, I mean, development for reducing poverty within China obviously had a huge amount of impact on whether or not that first MDG was met. That's for sure. And in another way, if that's what you're getting at, China's obviously had an effect on the global economy. But actually, I think certainly in terms of thinking about how global aid has helped that, and it obviously hasn't done it alone. It's had to do it with the private sector and with economic growth. But to the extent that aid has been able to both catalyze a bit of growth and also make sure that the poorest people in the poorest countries benefit from that growth, not just an elite. I think two things have helped. One was the MDGs and the SDGs, because they kind of brought people around a limited number of priorities where you could make a real impact, and they required people to measure whether or not what you were doing was making any difference. And to be honest, the other was the end of the Cold War, because up until then, aid was just used as a bribe in the Cold War, and no one cared how it was used, and it was used very, very badly, and it led to the debt crisis that we had to deal with in 2000 and the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. But I honestly do think that the MDGs made a huge difference, and the SDGs have built on that and obviously broadened it. But I think it's really helpful, and I think you can see the fact that it's helpful in the way that actually so many impact investors and multilateral companies do use the SDGs as a framework for describing what they do, because there's something useful about getting people to pull together in the same direction, even when they are relatively separate, independent organizations.
Before we kind of dig deep into the SDGs, because it's the MAGA hat now that, I'm definitely supporting SDGs, but I'm not a fund manager, but I'll sign anything that says I'm investing in the SDGs, which seems to happen. Why do you think the nonprofit or NGOs are not able to communicate in the language of the financial sector? Because the financial sector is far more predictable than the nonprofit sector. Mm-hmm. They all kind of run up the hill and off the cliff at the same time. So what is it that they can't get or understand about the financial sector that doesn't allow them to communicate with each other?
It's curious. I'm not sure I totally know the answer, but I got a couple of ideas, I suppose. I was surprised, because actually CARE, and I think some other NGOs as well, really prides itself on working with the private sector. We had a huge relationship with Barclays Bank when I was at CARE, for example. Mm-hmm. So we knew how to work with that bit of the financial sector. And that lasted years and had a positive impact for almost 1 million people. And so we really thought that, there should be more overlap between what we were doing and what impact investors could be doing. Mm-hmm. And so, we decided very kind of deliberately to go and have a look at that question and see what we could do. And as it happened, we got a bit lucky at the time. So people may have heard of the Cass Business School. I think it's
Yeah.
been renamed now the Bayes Business School.
Oh.
And they run a Centre for Charity Effectiveness and an MBA there. And through that, we got the chance to work with someone who had just stepped down from being the CFO of a FTSE 100, who was taking early retirement to think about impact investment and other things. And he did a little survey did a bit of scoping for us. And so he scoped two things. On the one hand, he looked at the impact investment sector, and then he looked at care and the international NGO sector. And, you know, broadly speaking, his conclusion was this should not be where your priority lies. That was his basic conclusion. And that was for these reasons. So when he looked at the impact investing sector, he found, as lots of the people watching will know, along the spectrum of impact investing, the vast majority of the investments are still at a market return. So I think the Global Impact Investment Network says it's about 2/3 is at market returns, about 18% is at close to market returns, and only about 15% is much closer to capital preservation. Then he looked at CARE's social enterprises, and CARE has launched a number of social enterprises over the years. We launched some during my term. Before that, CARE USA, which is even bigger than CARE UK, had a microfinance bank in Peru, which it eventually sold for an 8-figure sum. So, I mean, CARE's done some fairly major social enterprises in its time. But when he looked at our sort of current crop, his conclusion was that most of these were definitely at the capital preservation end of the spectrum at best. They certainly had revenues in them, which meant that they were sort of multiplying the effect of the initial aid dollars, which tend to go into them over a very, very long period of time, which was great. But they weren't really most of them were not really going to give people the kind of returns that they were looking for. So that was his conclusion. And I have to say, looking around, it seems to be a conclusion that other NGOs have come to as well. So, as I say, CARE USA, which is bigger than CARE UK, has launched in the last just few years an impact fund focused on gender justice. And I think they hoped that they would get impact investment into that fund. But most of the investment so far has come from CARE itself, from traditional institutional investors and donors like USAID and high net worth individuals. World Vision's got quite a big fund investing in microfinance, but I think that's primarily invested from the traditional sources of income that World Vision has, so small individual donors. Mercy Corps got one of the biggest ones called Mercy Corps Ventures, but again, I think it's largely self-seeded and self-funded. And although they do say that some of their enterprises have gone on to get follow-on capital, and they say they've raised about 300 million, I think some of that again is not from commercial and impact investors. So I don't think it's just a CARE thing that's struggled with that. But I sort of refuse to give up. I still sort of feel like there must be more overlap here. And I think we need to figure out those barriers and remove them and rebuild those bridges for a couple of reasons. One is because although it's true that, if only 15% of the spectrum is at capital preservation, 15% of $1 trillion in impact investment is still a lot of money. Now, obviously, that trillion is not an annual amount, but 15% of it is equivalent to the annual global aid budget of all of the countries in the OECD. So it's a lot of money. And if there's a project which involves a social enterprise that could be funded by impact investment instead of traditional aid, then that should not only can that work and support the social enterprise, but that aid can then be released to do something which only aid can do, which impact investment definitely can't do. like just go and keep people alive in Yemen and Afghanistan and places like that where there is not so much of a place for impact investment. So I'm still determined to find that way forward and have a look at some of those. Yeah.
But do you personally believe you can achieve a market rate return and provide impact?
So I'm going to spend a bit of time giving you two examples, which are a bit different. So one's closer to market rate, and that's something I'm working on right now, called Girls First Finance.
Oh yeah.
And the other is definitely closer to capital preservation, which is something that CARE worked on in Zambia, a water trust. But where I think it would be interesting to explore whether or not, with a bit of collaboration and a bit of learning from both sides with an impact investor, that could have been done with impact money rather than aid money, and actually even been better as a result. Do you have a preference on which one we start with?
No, I know the first one. So start with the second one then.
Okay, fine. Well, that works
Although the
chronologically too.
audience doesn't not
Well,
know
that
either
works.
one.
It works chronologically, so that's fine as well. So, CARE back in 1996 started a project in some informal settlements around Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, called Chipata was one of them, to bring clean water to the people who lived in that settlement, because there was no clean piped water. And that settlement had about 600,000 people living there. And I went back to visit because we were going to add something to that program nearly 20 years later, and it was still working really well. People were paying every day for their clean water, and they were doing that because it was cheaper, or certainly no more expensive than what they had to do in the past, which is buy water from private sellers, which they couldn't rely on being clean or treated. And that ongoing, payment certainly covered the maintenance as well as the expansion of that water trust. It also created a lot of good jobs for both engineers and sellers, and mainly women actually getting those jobs. So there was a lot of impact there. And it had been the UK government's aid programme, DFID, that had originally funded CARE to get that going at a cost of £10 million, which, if you spread that over the 600,000 people that were benefiting over the 20 years that was still working, that's only a penny a year in terms of how much it was costing to do that. So actually, now I'm wondering whether I've got that penny a year. Sounds wrong. Penny a day, I think, is what I mean. Very, very cheap. And the reason I was going is because we were going to turn the project into something that would collect waste as well. And what it is £1 a year. That's it. There you go. So refuse collection had proved even more problematic in this urban settlement for a long time. Various people had tried it. It was very, very difficult to get it to work. There were a few saintly residents who paid anyway for their weekly or monthly refuse collections, even though they hardly benefited at all, because so few people did. The people who did pay for it were still surrounded by everybody else's rubbish. And one of the main reasons we heard was that it was because it was charged on a weekly or monthly basis, and people just didn't have that in one go to be able to spend. Whereas one of the reasons they were able to afford the water is they would collect their water every day, and and they paid for it every day, so it was a very, very small amount, much more manageable. So eventually the team on the ground figured out that, well, if we combine the water and the refuse as a daily amount, and when you buy your water, you're buying your refuse collection too, then people will be able to afford it, because essentially we're spreading the costs into something much, much more affordable. And it took a certain amount of negotiation with the community for everyone to buy into this, because there was quite a lot of that hesitation based on previous experience that, like, some people pay for it, but other people either free ride or ruin it. But once it was all negotiated and eventually got going, within a matter of weeks, just weeks, the amount of rubbish that was being collected leapt from about 5% to over 70%. So it made a huge, huge difference. And it only put people's daily water up by a tiny amount. And I mean, I think that is a fantastically good deal that DFID got for its money. And the second project only took about £1 million to get going and seed. So that was equally cheap after only about 5 years. So I think that's amazingly good value that they got, and there's clearly a revenue stream in that organization. And it seems to me that is the kind of thing, even though it looks certainly closer to capital preservation than anything else, would be the kind of thing you would hope impact investment could get more involved with. And it seems to me that if CARE, who set that up back in the day, and an impact investor could have got together and figured out, how do we just have to make this either slightly more expensive, slightly more efficient? If it is slightly more expensive, could we help people with being able to afford that with some other income earning opportunities as well? It was only marginal maybe that we couldn't have made it something that was fundable from impact investment, which would have been a good investment, would have had a lot of impact, could have got a sufficient return, and then again could have freed up that aid and aid money for something else. And I just think that we need a little bit more willingness on the NGO side to say, wouldn't it be better if we just tweaked this model a bit, and maybe be willing to say it just needs to be that little bit more expensive to be genuinely financially, commercially sustainable, and that little bit of patience maybe. So you talked about whether or not NGOs could sort of speak to investors. That little bit of patience on the investor side to maybe kind of not walk away because an NGO hadn't kind of like spelt it all out in the way an investor wanted to see up front all by themselves, and say, well, there's a revenue stream there, there's a lot of impact there must be a way of making this work, let's help them make it work. And I think with that kind of persistence and commitment on both sides to a little bit of push and pull, that, and I would hope lots of others, could have been ripe for at least that 15% of the impact investment spectrum. Now, the other one is definitely more at the market rate return end of the spectrum.
When you'd say capital preservation, define that. Is that like no returns? Is it 1% returns?
So I'm just reading what the research was saying on the Global Impact Investment Network, but they were saying that about 15% of roughly the $1 trillion that they think is in impact investment now, about 15% of that they said closer to capital preservation, which I take to mean closer to capital preservation than to market rates. So
zero return.
well, I mean, I guess it means if it's closer to one end of the spectrum than the other, then it means it's at least it's less than half of market rates, I guess. But if it's closer, then it's not at capital preservation, so it's a bit higher than capital
But
preservation.
I when I often speak to institutional investors and fund managers about impact, they all say, "Well, it's money losing, it's charity, there's no return, there's no good fund manager, there's no track record, etc." So they believe those myths, and they push their own myths of all hedge funds always make 30% returns. And all private equity funds always get at least 30% returns. And all fund managers always hit their benchmark, when that's the biggest myth of all. So, this idea about capital preservation, because of impact, when the financial sector is wrong most of the time. I said jokingly to the head of Goldman Sachs that I have a feeling the investment manager is wrong half the time. He said, no, three-quarters. So someone who's overpaid by a factor of 4 and underperforms and is only 25% of the time accurate, what's the percentage of nonprofits in their decision making? Is it also 75% of all of their projects fail and are wrong?
Well, I suppose that like hedge funds and impact investors, with the NGOs, obviously, there's a variety, so people take different approaches, and you can be more or less cautious, right, in terms of what you do, and you can, in an ideal world, you can in some scenarios, like often a hedge fund would, you can say we want to have a spread of our activities. So some are high risk but maybe high return, and others are quite low risk but very certain return, and you want to spread across those. And to some extent, an NGO may well take that approach, and would typically look for quite different kinds of funding for those different bits of the spectrum as well. So typically funding from a government donor like USAID or the UK government they would want a lot of certainty on the return, unless it was also in a very kind of specific innovation pot from them. So then that would tend to be your really big programs where you've done it 10 times before in 5 other countries, you know what you're doing, you know what the impact's going to be, you know what the price is going to be, you can control all that and you deliver that. But sometimes, you really want to try something that's much more unusual and high risk. And then maybe 75% of the time it doesn't work, but that's kind of built in, that's a kind of deliberate risk you're taking for innovation. Typically, though, you're going to need different kind of funding for that. You're going to need, typically an NGO would use what's called unrestricted funding for that. So donations for public, where you're allowed to use it in whatever way you think is best. So I think when NGOs are being innovative and deliberately high risk, then you're going to have failures. But a lot of the time they will be being more cautious than that.
When you were running Gates, how long were you at Gates Foundation for Africa?
Well, I was at Gates for 7 years, and about 3 of that was as Africa director at the NDM.
Okay, so you put quite a bit of money probably to work over those 3 to 7 years. What was the most successful project for, let's call it, social or environmental return for the amount of money that you put in, either as a grant or an investment? Do you remember?
Well, so Gates did both, right? Gates does do both. It primarily makes grants. But it does also do what it calls program-related investments, which could be equity or loans or risk guarantees. And when it's doing that, it's usually doing it to try and leverage a lot more capital in, which is why, risk guarantees is often one of the ways. So it takes the first risk in order to pull in a lot of other capital. And also because it kind of knows and judges the risk a bit more carefully because it's kind of on an issue that it's really passionate about. Now, you're going to tend to use those investment vehicles in the types of development where there is some kind of revenue stream. So, for example, that was more common in, for example, water and sanitation. I just gave a water example. People are used to paying for water, but you can give them much better service than they normally get, still make a return, and much, much better impact. So there were certainly impact investments in that area. Also agriculture, which of course is a business, and in financial services. In health, most of it was much more likely to be grants. And that is because, you are, the Gates Foundation anyway, was mainly trying to save the lives of children who don't have an income and shouldn't be paying for that. And there's no doubt that it had some really big impact there. Not on its own by any means. The Gates Foundation worked with Rotary and the WHO over a long period of time, but they brought a new focus back to eradicating polio, and sure enough, wild polio has been eliminated in Africa now, and that's quite a stunning achievement. On their impact investment, program-related investments, certainly one of the ones I thought was really interesting was trying to work with private companies on reducing stockouts in pharmacies. So a big problem is that pharmacies never had in the medicines they were supposed to have in. And so people would go there looking for their medicine or often their contraception. They wouldn't find them. And it was because, the pharmacists were trained to be pharmacists, not stock controllers. They're small business people. And they did an investment in a company where using, digital technology, it was the company supplying the products to the pharmacists that took the responsibility for making sure that the pharmacy was always stocked. So they would track what the pharmacy was using. They would make sure that they were restocking it in time. That had a good business model and really good social impact because, if you can eliminate all of those wasted visits, that's good impact. But also it encourages people to come rather than discouraging people, so people give up going to the pharmacy and they stop health-seeking behaviour if when they look for it they can't even get it. So that was a good one on the unusually on the health side actually.
And I saw that Matt Damon started what might have been a not-for-loss, maybe it's a for-profit, maybe it's a non-profit, water.org charge for water. So installing a pump in a village, and people would pay that back. And he's raised a lot of money from various. Does that work better than what you were talking about? The water services linked to.
It depends on the details, but it's not necessarily very different. The reality is that people do pay for water, and will pay for water. And we all do, right?
Can we do that with the farmers too? They don't pay for water.
If they're in an irrigation system, they may well.
Not much.
But it's not unusual for people to pay for water. We all are used to paying for water. We all pay a small water bill, don't we? But in developing countries, people absolutely pay because you need it. So they're not going to go without it. And if they don't have a good system that's providing clean, safe, treated water, Either if they live in an urban settlement like we were working in Zambia, what they would typically do is they go into private sellers who have either trucked it in from who knows where, or they've got illegal drills pumping it up from who knows where. It's not treated. They're depleting the water table as well without any kind of control or regulation. And they'll charge them a lot for that. So they'll charge them at least as much as a public or regulated water company would charge them, and it's not as good. It's not as safe. Alternatively, in particular if they live in a rural area, they're paying through time, right? So what they're doing is usually the women and girls of a family are spending their whole day, every day, walking how many miles to a river to collect water. That's not cash, but that's definitely paying in time and a massive opportunity cost for them. If that's a girl missing school or a woman who could be working and actually earning cash rather than using up her time. So people really do pay, and they will pay. Poor people are extremely smart about what they spend their money on because otherwise they don't survive. And they recognize the benefit, and they will pay what it's worth, and they will pay. And as long as you're just charging what it costs to maintain a good, safe, clean system and keep it maintained, that's a valid thing to pay for. You don't need to gouge them for profits, and it's it can make a reasonable return. It should be able to make a reasonable return and deliver huge impacts here.
Do you believe of whether it's the for-profit private equity fund set to invest in Africa, supposedly following the SDGs, or a not-for-loss company that just can't seem to get it together, making money, or a nonprofit or a DFI? Who is more effective in actually creating long-term development in your experience?
I mean, I suppose what I was saying right at the beginning, in my experience, often the most effective things come when you blend people with different skills together. We know that from all sorts of walks of life, don't we? That the effectiveness of a team comes from its complementarity and diversity. And if we've got all of the right skills, we're going to do a much, much better job than any team that's just really good at one of those things. So a really good impact investment needs to be really good at impact and really good at investment. And if we only got one of those two skills in it, it's not going to be as good. So that's why I, in various ways, keep plugging away at trying to help those two communities work with each other more. I suppose you're right that DFIs, particularly, are trying to be in that space of straddling both worlds. That's for sure. I think I'd certainly like to see a lot of them have a broader spread of risk that they're allowed to take, and the UK government is certainly trying to allow the newly named British International Investment to have that. So some is much more return making, but some is not, and their goal is capital preservation overall, net capital preservation, which means some can miss. So that's good, and that's relatively recent where they've shifted those metrics for them. I think that's good. I think the other opportunity, maybe this is a time to talk a bit more about Girls First Finance, is where there really is a big market failure. And that's also where a good development organization as DFID was really tries to sort of spot that in economies and fix the things that are creating the failure, and then just let the private capital pour in. So Girls First Finance is established by someone we both know, Robert, Andrea Pizziconi. She was working in Africa in a purely commercial way, trying to help universities develop their campuses. Some of her investors were commercial, some were DFIs, but they were earning a return. And as she was doing that, she saw more and more, not that this is in any way a purely African issue, it is definitely global. It happens in the UK and the US as well. But she saw more and more how many young women at university were being sexually exploited, either by what gets called sugar daddies or sponsors. So men who would sexually exploit them because they knew, and then would pay their tuition fees because they couldn't afford them on their own, or sometimes by lecturers in exchange for letting them pass their courses and get the grades that they had actually earned. And particularly where it comes to the sex for fees and sex for living expenses when you're a student, it didn't take long for someone from a financial investment background to spot that money was the cause of this. I mean, social norms allow it to be treated as a normal, necessary evil, but it's the fact that so many of those young women couldn't access the funding they needed to get the higher education they wanted to set themselves up for the rest of their lives that made them so vulnerable to that kind of a pressure. So Andrea started looking into, well, why not? I mean, higher education, after all, it's such a brilliant investment. People are used to the idea that you take a student loan because it's so worth your while to pay that back because of the higher income you're going to get as a result of that. So why is that not happening? What's going on? And she discovered that perhaps not that surprisingly in poorer countries, and it's probably true in developed countries too, the quantity of student loans available from governments was not enough. Not enough for everybody, but also not enough to cover all of your real costs of really surviving. And secondly, because there was a sort of a belief that education should be sort of free, quite often what happens is that governments will also say any private lenders who want to come into the space of educational loans are only allowed to charge a below market interest rate. Maybe that's partly because they don't want them competing with the government system, or maybe they, just genuinely think that's all that students should have to pay. Either way, it's obviously a massive discouragement to private capital to do that. So you find a situation whereby, so Girls First Finance has now particularly started focusing on vocational and technical colleges because tends to focus on students who are lower down the socioeconomic pyramid. In those kinds of colleges in Kenya, for example, less than a quarter of students are getting any funding from the government. Those that do are only getting about a third of their real costs covered. There's very, very limited alternatives from traditional banks or microfinance institutions who don't traditionally lend in that space. So one of the alternatives is very, very expensive loans in the commercial sector at like 180% interest rates. And so then your option is, well, either I don't get this education, which I, really need to fulfill my potential for the rest of my life, or I succumb to this very widespread practice of, having a sugar daddy, so-called. Couldn't be a more inappropriate term. And it's extremely widespread, and Girls First Finance reckon that that's happening to probably 50% of wow. Girls in post-secondary education in Africa. So it's huge, and yet it would seem that if you could structure a loan appropriately so that those young women could do their training or their degree, depending on what level they're at, pay that back over, the kind of longer length of time, like 5 to 10 years that we're used to student loans taking, they would have that higher income as a result of their training and education. They would be able to pay that back. Currently, traditional lenders are not really doing it, but if you can make sure that's not because the government is stopping you doing the interest rate, so you have to make sure that policy issue is dealt with if that's the case in a particular country. But if you can make sure that's not the case, then you're really down to whether or not you can convince your investors that you've got the rate of return and the underwriting. So then the next thing comes in, well, traditional underwriting would say, well, these are young women who haven't got a job yet. They come from a poor family who can't really give them much kind of guarantor security. That's very, very risky. Whereas if you use some of the tools that microfinance institutions have used over the years, you can actually do something much more realistic than those just rather broad sweep assumptions, which include definitely gender discrimination against women rather than men. And on top of that, Girls First Finance is also going to use some AI tech and also try and address some of the non-financial pressures around their clients as well. So make sure that they're getting mentoring support for their future career, counselling and wellbeing services, budgeting support. Try and deal with as many of those issues which potentially put their repayments at risk and their lives at risk as you can. Then you can really bring down the underwriting risk. There's also quite a big incentive for the educational establishments as well, who at the moment lose a lot of students along the way because they can't keep up their fees. And so they therefore lose that place and they lose the income that would have come with that place. And so you can defray a bit of that cost with them because if you can get all of the students paying all of their fees, that's a huge bonus for the educational institutions. So you can share that benefit with them and use some of that to protect investors. So we're very convinced that that's a model that, because it's fixing such a market failure, will definitely be able to provide market returns as well as huge social impact, which is obviously more in the 67% space of the impact investment spectrum. So we hope that will get oversubscribed fairly soon. And we're just in the process of, we're in the sort of pilot phase right now, proving the concept in Kenya.
Okay, I'm going to take some of the questions. Mark wanted to know, do you know of examples of social enterprises that frame their business in terms of the SDGs? He's looking for a format to model while building an SDG analysis from our organization while it executes this collective action project.
I'll try and think if there's a specific example in the back of my mind while I give you some other answers. So, I mean, the UN itself provides a kind of a framework that they encourage businesses to try using to measure their impact, both positive and negative, on the SDGs. So that's worth having a look at. I think you might, I think you'll either find it under UN SDGs, or you might also find it through the UN Global Business Global Compact. It's called, isn't it? Global Compact, the UN Compact of Business. So they have that. I mean, there are definitely traditional NGOs like CARE, as well as a lot of big companies these days who do it, which could be worth having a look at. But I'm sure smaller social enterprises do as well. My advice to one would certainly be, only try and measure a few of the SDG indicators that are really most material for your social enterprise. Don't kill yourself trying to measure 17 goals and about 180 sub-indicators. Just do the ones that are really relevant for you. And try and use that as an opportunity to find out who else is working on those ones you're working on too, because that'll be a good source of lessons, hopefully. Sorry, that's not like a literally a
It's
website
all right.
address to go
You
and
might
look
think
at,
of
but
something
hopefully
then
it's useful.
later. Arthur wanted to know, he made a comment here that Gin's figures for impact investment in 2018 was 285 billion. They figured they just announced in 2022 was 1.165 trillion. That's a continuation of that 62% compound growth. Do you think that is correct?
Who knows? I mean, when figures jump that much, you sometimes wonder if it's the way it's being counted, don't you? On the other hand, I think they pride themselves on trying to add some rigor to an area which is notoriously flexible, let's say. So I think they probably try to avoid that risk. And it is something that is, growing in popularity. So whether it can maintain a trajectory like that, I'm not sure, but I think it will continue to grow. I'd certainly, as you'll have gathered from what I've said through the talk, hope that the the growth can be more evenly spread along the spectrum. um, um, and and I think the other question in a way is, you know, if you like, beyond the edge of that spectrum where there is investment making market returns or more than market returns, but not having a positive ESG impact on the world, why are we letting that even happen? Shouldn't all investment be net positive for the world?
Yeah, I there was a very large private equity firm in Europe that looked at all, they had billions, I mean 30 billion in assets. And they looked at their investments and they started rating them or coding them according to which SDG they were addressing. So I thought, wow, that's really cool. Until I actually dug into each of the companies, you know, curing hunger, we're in a food coloring company, or we're, addressing water by, focusing on turbine production for gas generation. So when I confronted them with that, that you're really, this is not cool because you're just putting a big bullseye. They took it down. They took it completely down. Unfortunately, a journalist figured out a way of retroactively looking at a website from a year ago. I didn't know there was a website for that. So, and then they published an article about that. But that happens quite a bit because the SDGs have become the flavor of the month. Everybody wants to be a member of the club, but not actually follow the rules. Doesn't that bug you?
I mean, it bugs me, but I also think it's a good sign because I think it's actually how change often happens in the world, which is that people say they're going to do the right thing, and then once they've said it enough, they start feeling like I actually better do it now. But they tend to start saying they're going to do it first. Like people say they're going to start going to the gym before they start going to the gym. It's a bit similar, right? And so it's how change happens. So I I don't always see it as a completely negative thing, but you hope it's a phase people are going through on their way to something better. If it's purely, you know, disingenuous and they never intend to do anything about it, then obviously it's nothing but bad. But often I think it's one of the early steps on the journey, and that's a journey we want people to take. And it's sometimes it's possible to do the whole leap in one go, but often it won't be for an organization.
Okay. Aaron wanted to know, do you subscribe with the Columbia University School of Thought that sustainability should be donation/charity driven, or perhaps the MIT model of international development where economic force of supply and demand need to mainline development economics with free market forces?
I mean, I think there's always going to be a role for donations and charity in the world. but as I was saying earlier, in a sense, I think it's a good thing if that is focused as much as possible on things which only charity can do. And equally, I think that everything else ought to also be sustainable. And I think sustainable definitely includes commercially sustainable, but we need to carry on having that conversation that started, way back in Rio, if not before, on that right balance between the three pillars of sustainability, of social, economic, and environmental, and make sure that the level of commercial returns that we regard as sustainable are reasonable. And that 30% figure that you mentioned earlier isn't. I mean, it's okay if a few things come good and you find a unicorn and all of that, but it can't be seen as the average benchmark. That is clearly not sustainable.
What can this audience do that's watching live, and also the ones that will get the replay, which we will send out later this evening, help you? What can they do to help you with your work?
Well, I mean, I'm not looking for people to help me specifically, but I'd love everyone, and I'm sure they are, which is probably why they're here. But to just keep working at growing, that piece of the Venn diagram, that can pull more impact work, that is, maybe marginal from a commercial point of view, towards just being that little bit more commercial to be able to benefit from impact investment. And also, if you're coming more from the impact investment end of the bridge, to just have that bit more patience to kind of work with the NGOs and others to help them turn enterprise into something that could receive your benefit, and don't expect them all to have figured all of that out. So I think it's really just, this is an important part of the future. We need to kind of cover it on both of those ends, whichever place we've started, and work together.
One final question from Meg. Why do NGOs have a challenge communicating with financial sector? Of course, to focus on SDGs. She has a project shown to reduce carbon emissions on smoke-free stoves. To the Maasai, 6,000 distributed, demand 30,000, reduce wood needed, etc. Communicating to investors remains a challenge as Maasai and usual. Any advice?
I mean, I'm sure you've looked around, but I mean, there's been quite a few cook stove projects over the last decade or so, I would say, that have been relatively successful and raised money, certainly from philanthropy, if not impact investment. And clearly that option around carbon credits now is an extra one. I think that, if you've got your gold certificate for the project, you should be able to find people that will buy that carbon credit. And if that's what you're struggling with, then I think there are some good organizations and consultants around that could help with that. So I definitely think you're looking in the right place. Maybe if you're struggling to communicate it, you've been unlucky with who you're communicating with, and try again with someone new.
Thank you. I have to wrap up because I'm very cognizant of your time, and we're also going to do a short mixer. I want to really thank you a lot for the work that you're doing, and I hope that we're able to help you. Let's just take a quick group selfie. Just wave to the camera, and the system will collate all the photos. You can prove that you were actually working today. And Laurie, thank you so much. And I'm sure that your project with women in Africa will be a great success. I want to thank our entire production crew for making this webinar possible. Sam, our producer, crypto genius and ramen critic. Ricky, my absolute better half with no filter. Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity. Vladimir Putin, our head of conflict resolution, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Nobel Prize winner for stupidity, Elon Musk, our humility coach, and Donald Trump, our prison inmate fashion advisor. So thank you all very, very much. We're going to go right into the mixer. So you don't have to do anything. The system will kind of drive you over there and just set up, choose your camera and audio, and then the system will connect you. Laurie, thank you so much.
Thank
We'll
you,
send
Robert.
out a replay later. If you have anything that you want me to share with that email, just let me know. And congratulations on all of your work. Let's start this.